Hello. Okay. Hi, everybody. So I don't think I need to introduce myself. Pretty much everybody probably knows me already. I'm Bron Thulke. I am the co-founder and CEO of a startup called YouLive, as in You Live to Travel. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story tonight. We are a travel management platform. We first started building YouLive in its current form in early 2017. And for the first couple of years, that was just myself and our CEO, Jen Fine, who's also on the call now. Shout out to Jen. And together with our UX designer. Naturally, as a startup, we needed to reduce costs and just get an MVP up and going. Did we cut corners? No, we did not. We straight away started doing things the right way because we wanted to make sure that we were scalable and cost effective for our DevOps and maintenance on an ongoing basis, and to make sure that we could scale as needed, because we totally expected to have 100,000 visitors to our site in the first couple of weeks. Didn't happen, but the good news is that we have continued to grow and grow and grow, and from day one we chose to use Amazon AWS cloud for all of our infrastructure. So I mean, that's the decision to make that felt right at the time for various reasons, which I'll go through. So we started off with Amazon EC2 instances for our Windows servers, and we set up a full CI/CD pipeline as well from the very beginning. So when I say MVP, I don't literally mean static website running from a shifty little Linux box. It was a proper setup from day one. This beautiful slide is going to be the last beautiful one for a little while. I'm very sorry. It's all boring from here. I start getting into some boring infrastructure diagrams. So this is how we started out, mostly using Amazon, as I said. So as you can see, we have one EC2 instance, which we call staging, and I'll call staging from here on, which hosts our test environments. So we have two test environments, staging and pre-prod. Staging is where we do most of our sprint testing. So every time that one of us commits a change and pushes it, it ends up automatically being built onto our staging server. And then we have our pre-prod environment, which usually, asterisk at the end, is basically an exact replica of our production environment. Current situation pending, which you'll see. So yeah, pre-prod is where we do our final regression testing before pushing through to production. When we first launched, we had a SQL Server database as well. Can everybody see my cursor there? Is that working nicely? Yay! So we had a SQL Server Express database running on the same instance. So really low cost and simple to maintain. And both the websites were just connecting into databases on that. Pretty soon after that, though, we did step up to use RDS for the databases. So we just have one instance for our test databases, one instance, two databases running on it. And then we have our production EC2 database server, which was just running the website itself. And again, originally was running SQL Server Express, and eventually we moved to RDS for that. So both of these servers, so we run our actual websites on an IIS web server, and all of these sites are also connecting to Amazon S3 for file storage, which is all of our planner and traveler files that they upload, as well as some of our platform files. And we also have Lambda functions for running reminders out of the system, so things like payment reminders and task reminders and the like. We use CloudWatch both to monitor the instances to a certain extent and also to schedule the running of our Lambda functions. And then back up to the top here, you can see our little CI/CD pipeline related stuff. We chose to run with TeamC for a build server, and then Octopus Deploy for releasing out to our systems. Yes, there are a lot of lines on here. I tried to simplify it. I struggled. I gave up. So the pros of this setup for us were, first of all, especially back then, but still now to a certain extent, Amazon AWS does tend to be quite cheap for running these sort of virtual machines in my experience, especially compared to Azure. We're not talking about a lot. We're just talking about a few bucks here and there, but as a startup, that really does matter. Plus, early on, pretty much straight off out of the gate, Amazon at that time especially were doing a big push towards startups, and they wanted to give us money. So they gave us credits to use Amazon services. So we said, yes, please. So we went with Amazon. The other key here was that I have been running Windows servers for over 15 years, hosting various websites on IIS, doing all that through my other website consulting business. So I'm pretty comfortable with running virtual machines with IIS, and I'd also previously been using TeamCity and Octopus Deploy for that pipeline. So it was all pretty easy to get it up and going. And also the ability to just run a SQL Server Express on the machine to start with, again, a huge cost saving for us. And in terms of the console itself, the AWS console I was kind of familiar with. It's pretty straightforward. Back then, we're talking early 2017, some of you might remember the Azure portal didn't start out like what it is now. It used to be very different, and I just used to get overwhelmed with it. Whenever I tried to jump into it, I couldn't find what I was looking for, so I'd get lost. So I got to the point where I just sort of gave up for a little while. But the problem, of course, with this sort of a setup, first of all, I am not a system admin, don't want to be ever, but it kind of means by running instances like this, I have to be. I have to manage the Windows updates and the antivirus and any firewall issues. And so suddenly, where I am a developer who wants to develop stuff, and in our startup, we need me to focus on developing stuff, I could get pulled off for hours or days on end dealing with issues that might have come up on those instances. It would cost a lot of money to get actual system admins involved, and so usually that's just pretty much an outright no, unless something really bad had happened. And with that all, of course, comes the security concerns as well, tied in with the system admin, making sure that everything is secure. It's not hard, quote unquote, to make sure that it is, but it's when things go wrong that you just don't have time to do that in the startup. And one of the small cons of this setup is TeamCity is actually a little bit of a memory hog, usually if you let it go a bit crazy. So that was one thing in particular that we often found. Our staging server actually had to be a larger instance anyway than our production because of everything we had running on it. So stuff like that, you kind of get to the point where you're thinking, well, I need to have another instance. That's going to cost me another $80 to $100 US. That's a lot of money. You start thinking, well, where else could I be putting this? What are my other options? So the flip side of this was Azure. As Azure became more stable and started offering more services, we're a .NET platform, it's .NET framework. We are currently right now actually in the process of moving across to core, but everything right now is on the highest .NET framework version that we can ever hit. And so it always felt anyway like Azure is probably where we should have been. And because of all of the issues that can come with running your own EC2 instances, David, .NET 5, yes, I've gone straight to .NET 5. So yeah, because of all the issues with managing your own instances, PaaS, a platform as a service, really attracted us. We're small, we need to focus on our areas of expertise. Plus, I really like shiny things. I'm not gonna pretend that doesn't attract me. Give me 5 years, I may be looking at Amazon again because it's got a new interface. But no, I do appreciate shiny things, and I like to see what's new and what I can get better improvements out of. The tipping point for us came last year when, I've got to say, we're a travel startup, mind you, and COVID hit, and ouch is all I can say. And we applied to Microsoft for a sponsorship for our startup, and they were so kind and generous as to give us Azure credits. And we said, thank you very much. That's it. We're done. Let's do this. So I was able to basically convince the CEO at that point as well that we should definitely give this a go. So with that, I started to move our environment. So the first step was always going to be the test environments because they're test environments. So I started by moving our test website. Well, the plan was to move our test websites to Azure App Service. And the initial plan was actually to leave the database at RDS and take it one step at a time. My experience actually was that I couldn't do that because as soon as I had the web app running on a different cloud, the connection with RDS became really slow. I also have tried it the other way around. When I was running applications on an Azure EC2 instance, connecting to an Azure database, it just ran slow. As soon as I had them on the same cloud, it was all fine. If there are any SQL experts out there or cloud experts out there who would like to explain that, I would love to hear it. My assumption, and when I've talked to other people, their assumption too, is they don't want it to necessarily run nicely like that, so they don't optimize those sort of connections. Anyway, bottom line was, very quickly I realized I would have to run the databases on Azure from day one as well. So that's what I did. So you can see here, I ended up setting up a web app with slots for my staging and pre-prod. The web app is not in use right now because we're only doing the test environments right now, and each of those have their own Azure SQL databases. I set up both of the databases using the serverless pricing for Azure because I had a lovely conversation with somebody from Microsoft support, specifically to do with SQL Server stuff. And I will be touting all night about Microsoft support. It's been wonderful. I've had conversations with people in the actual areas of expertise that I needed at the right time. It's been very helpful. And this particular gentleman explained to me that for systems like, especially our pre-prod, but also staging, they're not running for a large chunk of time. So the serverless pricing model that Azure offers there works really well because they go to sleep when they're not being used, and then it just ramps up when it's being used for the few hours a week that it might be used for pre-prod especially. So migrating that data, backing up and restoring an Amazon RDS database to another cloud, it may seem like an easy thing to do. It's actually not. They don't make that simple. You can't just download a back file. So instead, I actually managed to come across a Microsoft Data Migration Assistant, and this tool is really easy to use. It does the job it's meant to do super quickly. You just set up a new project with a target source and target database, and you can actually migrate all of your schema and data straight across. I also did actually have to speak to the support people about this. So again, I logged a ticket through the portal console because I was having an error when I tried to do it. At one point, I was trying to do a copy across, and I was saying, it worked before. And I was talking to somebody, I think it was that guy that recommended the serverless pricing, actually. I was talking to him, and he said, that's okay, I'll have a look. And he jumped in and he got me a different version of it as well because he thought maybe he'd found a problem, blah, blah, blah. Fantastic, right? All one-on-one personal support. And it turned out that what I was actually doing was trying to migrate it to my local machine. And that doesn't work. That's not actually, well, it didn't at that time anyway. So that was one little lesson that I had there. It was when I was trying to do some performance debugging, actually. So that's why I was going from cloud to my machine, and I just thought, oh, I'll use this tool. Didn't work for that. But to go cloud to cloud, it was really simple and straightforward. So within half an hour, I had both my staging and pre-prod databases copied across, and I was happy. Then for migrating the websites, I just used the existing pipelines with TeamCity build and the Octopus pipeline. I followed a very simple tutorial from Octopus about how to deploy to Azure from Octopus, and I was amazed at how quickly I was able to do that. But then Azure DevOps was appealing to me because it would mean no more TeamCity, which would reduce costs because I wouldn't have to run a VM for that. And if I was going to have to learn any new build tool, I might as well go with Azure DevOps. And so the original goal was to use Azure pipelines for both the build and the release. And of course, one of the biggest reasons for that is that it would all be there in one place. So I got the build pipeline working first, quite quickly actually, and then I replaced TeamCity, and that was that. So happy. Then I added the first release pipeline for Azure DevOps. So at first I was just going to the Azure app slots. So I was figuring that I would do this path here, but instead of going through TeamCity and Octopus Deploy, I was going to go through Azure DevOps and come through into my slots here. And I figured that I would just still have to run my pipeline through Octopus to push to the actual EC2 instance down here. I just figured that was probably going to be easier. But once I had pretty quick success with my releases through to the web apps, I decided to have a bit of a challenge and try to get it releasing through Azure DevOps onto the IIS on EC2. And it was actually relatively simple. So that was great. I had my whole DevOps running through Azure DevOps. But then another reality hit. Azure pipelines are actually quite slow. My experience was the builds can take a while, and that's not so bad because, you know, if a build takes an extra 5 or 10 minutes to what it used to, that's fine. The difference being, of course, that on Octopus Server especially, all of the packages are cached already. So it's quite quick to get going on the build. On an Azure pipelines build, it's firing up a new instance every time. at least in the free version. So therefore, it's got nothing cached. So it has to go off and download all those packages. It has to wait for workers in the process. So that takes quite a while. And then when it comes to actually doing the release, honestly, I've got evidence of some of our releases taking up to 18 minutes to do the release, of which a large chunk of that time, the website was offline because it had already put it into maintenance mode. So it was quite painful. Thankfully, these were only our test sites that we were experiencing this with, but I had a lot of flushes of, oh God, what have I done? What have I done? This isn't going to work. And then I had a bit of a brain moment and thought, well, hang on a minute. I can still use Octopus, and there's Octopus Cloud these days. Now, Octopus Cloud itself is still a bit slower than the old Octopus server because you have to wait for workers as well. So when you hit to do a release, it still has to wait its turn. Although again, I think the more you pay, the faster that process would be. So what I did was I actually set up an Octopus Cloud instance, and I reset up all of my pipelines, and I actually set up Octopus to also deploy through to Azure, and it worked really well. And I had releases finishing within 10 or 15 seconds. So big difference. So that was a bit of a no-brainer. I do also like Octopus, shout out to them, because they are a Brisbane-based company. They have excellent support and they're constantly improving their products. So I was actually really comfortable with the decision to stick with them for this part of the pipeline. So this is the final setup here. We've got Azure repos as well, which I'll come back to. Running through Azure DevOps for the build, and then I'm using Octopus Deploy for the releases, and that's going through to the web apps on Azure as well as through to the EC2 instance for our final production releases each sprint. So the move back to Octopus for releases, though, the thing was that I'd already set up those releases in Azure. And as I said before, I liked the idea of having everything in one place, my builds and my releases and everything. I'd already drunk that Kool-Aid. So I decided to actually keep my release pipeline in Azure because Octopus offer plugins, or whatever they call, I think it's plugins, whatever they call them anyway, in Azure for connecting with your Octopus. So what I've got is our standard pipeline, our standard sprint pipeline here. From the build itself, I take an artifact of the build, and then I push that through onto the staging, and then from staging we go to pre-prod, and from pre-prod we go to production, and there are manual checks along the way for that as well. So the actual stages for the staging, so that very first push out, I create an Octopus release and then I deploy it through Octopus. So I tell Octopus to deploy it. And then for the subsequent releases to pre-prod and prod, I just tell it to do its promote through. So if you're in Octopus itself, if you're familiar with it, you'd be doing a deploy to X environment, and it would actually basically just be promoting that release up and through. So it's the same thing that this is doing here. But the benefit of this then is that I get my one little place where I can check my releases in Azure pipelines, and I can see how the builds went through to the releases and all the rest. So I'm really happy with that. And it does also mean that if I come back and solve that problem of slow Azure pipeline releases, then I've already got that ready to go. It was the free version. Well, no, sorry, it's not the free version, because I don't think there is a free version of Azure DevOps, but we are getting Azure DevOps under our sponsorship. So we're not paying for any extra work processes. But this is the thing also, is that even if I was paying for extra worker processes, as far as I was aware, I would still have to wait for a process to be available. I could just possibly have more than one at a time. So I'm not 100% sure on that though, but that's what I read from the doco. And also Barbara asked, could I use a local agent for the Azure build pipeline for an actual machine? Yes, that is an option. If you are prepared to pay for another virtual machine, and that is an option, Barbara, yes. And yes, that's right. You have up to 5 devs on your free, well, on the entry level account. So yeah. So as an aside also, in terms of the slots and the swapping, I've got the slots, but these releases are not doing any slot swappings. Did I say that right? Yes. These releases are literally just pushing through the slots as if they were just another environment. My plan is eventually to probably use slot swapping for a pre-production warm-up. I just need to plan that out in terms of how we're going to do our database migrations with that as well, because my understanding of that would be that if I did a slot swap, and I had to run the database migration on the first run, there could still be some downtime there. So I need to come up with the final plan for that. But where we are right now, the truth is that our app actually is quite fast to warm up. It only takes maybe 10 or 15 seconds on that first load up. So that's not a priority for us right now. And also, we're not at scale, and we are still in a position where we're quite happy with running automatic code first migrations on release. So that's working really well for us right now. So I'm not going to overcomplicate that at this stage, but that's my plan eventually, is to start using slot swapping once I've got production on Azure as well. Now, the one thing I said earlier that I was going to come back to was the fact that I just sneakily changed from Bitbucket to Azure repos. Here's a lesson for anybody else who does go through this. Azure repos is the best place to have your code if you are using Azure pipelines, without a doubt, because you get really nice flow through of your commits through your builds and your releases. And one of the things in particular that we do is I've set up a Jira integration, so this top one here, so that you can look at a particular bug in Jira and see all the commits and the deployments for it. And also I've got these Slack messages that come out through Octopus Deploy, which, by the way, I could have gone with the alerts that come out from Azure as it went through the pipeline, but I stuck with the Octopus direct ones. And I was actually having some issues with Octopus itself. It would get the details of the commits, but then it wouldn't pump them through into the release notes. And I had a conversation with their support about it, and they were kind of scratching their heads. And then while they went away and deliberated over it, I thought, I'll just try moving it to Azure repos, and bang, everything suddenly started working. And when I said that to them, they said, oh yes, by the way, you need to have it on Azure repos if you want that to work. So that's fine. I was totally fine with that. In my opinion, I don't find there's much difference between Bitbucket and Azure as a remote Git repo. I generally don't find there's much difference with any of them. The pull request functionality is quite good on both of them. There's pros and cons, so I was quite happy to move that across. I'm kind of flippant with my remote repository, so that's where we are now. So that's why we've switched to that. And Pratik had just actually brought up a really good point also. The writing is on the wall for Azure DevOps, though. The future is GitHub Actions, yes, but I have been promised that is not going to be the case for some time. And I decided that I didn't want to jump to that ship yet, because I feel like it's still early days. And my experience with GitHub Actions so far has been somewhat confusing. And I decided that, given that I've heard a few people from Microsoft saying, no, Azure pipelines aren't going anywhere at this stage, I think it's a pretty safe ship to have jumped on at this point in time anyway. Come back to me in a year or two's time and I might be crying. And Application Insights, I don't think it needs any more introduction. If anybody has used Application Insights before, then I feel like I'm probably already going to be preaching to the converted. So for me, this was one of the biggest wins with our move to Azure from AWS. On AWS, when you're using an EC2 instance, it's kind of a bit of a closed box. And if you want to have stats coming out, you need to be setting up your own APM tool, your Stackify or whatever, right? And it's just not something that I ever managed to prioritize. And again, as a startup, that's quite costly. The entry level for a lot of the APM tools is over $80 or $100. The last time I checked, I'm not sure if it's even more now. I'm not sure if it's less. Anyway, it's not something that I've ever done, right? So when I did get cloud, we do have CloudWatch working for some monitoring. So we get things like alerts when the CPU gets up or the networks or whatever, but that's pretty much it. So Application Insights, the setup documentation was, to be quite honest, all over the place. Every time I tried to just pick out bits of what I needed to do, it would all be different information. So what I ended up doing was I found an actual tutorial end-to-end on creating a new web application with Application Insights. It was some documentation on the Microsoft Docs. And so I went through that with a new app, and then I retrofitted it to our existing app. So I looked and checked how they'd hooked it all up. Got it all working for the staging and for the dev and the staging environments, and thought, fantastic. And then next thing I turned around and looked, and it was working for production as well. And it was magic. And I literally stressed out for a minute thinking, did I just release to production by accident? How is this already working? Especially when my production is running on an EC2 instance. It turned out a few months before, I had tried to get application insights working. I say a few months, it was probably a couple of years. I tried to get application insights working, and then I'd put a pin in it because it wasn't working quickly, or I couldn't work out the interface, and I'd left the instrumentation key in there. And that instrumentation key was key to just, once I got the other bits working and set up in there, like the config and stuff, it just worked out of the box. At first, when I first started on Azure, I didn't expect to get AI working for a long time. And now here I am. I get amazing information out of it, and it has already helped us to escalate and identify and fix a number of issues that we either didn't know were happening in the system or that came up suddenly, and the turnaround was really fast in comparison to in the past. I said to somebody the other day, I don't know why that's the case. We're always logging the same amount of information. But especially when you're like one of only 2 or 3 developers, who sits there on your production box and goes through every day and looks at every error that's happened in your logs, especially when you also have your other trace information in there that's filling them up, right, and making them busy. So we didn't catch things then. So now I can catch things easily. So what I've got here is a real screenshot, because I really wanted to do a demo, but there's no way I could fit that into my talk tonight. But this screenshot here just shows you, this is the transaction search. And up here, actually, what I've done is I've excluded the requests, which is, basically just every request that hits the website. I've excluded those. And so you can just see some traces and a couple of exceptions that have come out from this system. So we use Serilog. Historically, we used Serilog and used Async to put our logs out to file and also to seek. But those 2 things now, once we move fully to Azure, will be no longer required. So I configured Serilog to put any log information or errors or anything out to AI. So I just added a sync for that. And I do also have a catch-all exception filter that I use to log out when nothing else picks up an exception. And so that's actually what this is an example of down here. I would get a trace out if it was an exception that, say, a null object or something. I would get a trace out because Serilog would be dumping that out. Now, as application insights, though, is also out of the box logging these exceptions. And these are also unhandled exceptions. These are unhandled exceptions that haven't even ended up going through my exception filter, such as where they've come through and tried to request an invalid URL altogether. In fact, I'm still yet to optimize my logging, because now I have this, I can actually turn off and just rely on the application insights to log out all of my unhandled exceptions. I don't have to catch it through my own filter now, and that'll clean that up a lot. These controller for path was not found. They're quite annoying. They get in the way. At the moment, my solution for that is that I just run queries, log queries. And so I've set up log queries, 2 in particular for recent traces and recent exceptions, where I exclude the sort of errors or messages that I don't care about. So for example, with our traces at the moment, pending the next release of YouLive, I have every single time we send a reminder, I log the fact that we sent an invitee a reminder. And I don't need that now. So I've taken that out because at the moment that just fills it up. But yeah, so this is basically the logs in your application insights, the logs down the left-hand side. So you can write your own little query out. There's really great, on the left-hand side here, really great helpers for finding the tables and the columns that are available in each of them. And just highlighting 2 of my favorite things. First of all, the tabs. So you can have multiple queries that you can then just flick between. And this here, you can choose to show it in your local time, which is really helpful, because I also don't always want it in local time, because all of our database dates are stored in UTC. So it's nice to be able to flick between depending on the context at the time. So that's about, that's absolutely not it for application insights. I could talk for hours about application insights, but they're my 2 favorite things at the moment, because what this means is that every day or every couple of days, I'll come in and just quickly have a look, pull out these queries, run them and see if there's something that's happening that shouldn't be happening and work out why. I have also set up alerts. It's quite easy to set up alerts so that you can get an email when you have something go wrong. And there's also now an Azure mobile application which can do push notifications. So I get a push notification now also when I get more than a certain number of exceptions within a 10-minute window. And that's already twice that's come up. Now, admittedly, once of them was where it was just like a lot of invalid URL requests. So at the moment, that's not helpful, but I also figure it's good to know if somebody's trying to hack your system, they're trying all the admin URLs, it's good to know that sort of thing's being done. So yeah, so that's really great. A shout out to Scott Hanselman at the moment has Azure Fridays, which is a weekly chat with different people about Azure. And there was actually one a few weeks ago about Azure mobile application. That's the way I heard about it. And they go into a little bit more about setting it up and the features that are available in it. So if you're interested in having a look at that, I recommend going and looking at his feed. All right, Azure favorite things. So I so far don't regret at all making the move from AWS to Azure. I've been really happy with the process. Microsoft support in particular, I've been really impressed with. I can't speak for everybody, but my experience with Amazon has not been positive with support. I've just never really had that real connection. It's always been I've got this problem, and you get a very scripted response, and if it doesn't fix it, it very quickly becomes too difficult to try and sort it out. Whereas with Microsoft, I've always ended up talking with somebody personally, and they've stuck with me, and they're almost always it's straight away like, here's a phone number, or here's a Zoom, let's work this out, or Teams. So that's been really great. Azure DevOps, I do really like, especially for smaller projects. We have smaller projects, smaller websites that we build through YouLive for some of our clients where they just need a little website. And I've been using Azure pipelines for each of those recently, and it does work really well. So again, if you are thinking about switching, or if you're looking at different pipeline options, different DevOps options, I'm happy to answer your questions about my experiences along the way, because I feel like I ran into a few doozies with the setup, and our setup isn't even a complex one. So some good lessons learned. But absolutely, above all at the moment, my favorite thing is application insights. I'm really enjoying that. So yeah, diving into the statistics, and it's been really great. And I can't wait to have the full production system also running on there, so that I can get even more stats through. The next steps for me now are obviously to move the production site to Azure Web Apps. Going to look at the Azure Key Vault to do the right thing with our secrets and keys. We're doing almost the right thing right now, but there are improvements we can make. That's all I'll say. And the file storage. So at the moment, we still have our files at S3. We also still have our Lambda function running. So I will be looking at whether or not we stay with S3 or move to Azure Storage. And I'll be looking at whether or not we move to Azure Functions for our reminders, which we probably will in the end, because why not? So that's it. Thank you to everybody for listening. And I think there's a few questions in chat that I haven't covered, so we can go back and have a look at them.